Hello, good morning or good afternoon. We are going to begin learning a new unit called the Civil Rights Movement. But we're going to begin with the roots of the Civil Rights Movement. Here we are. All right, I hope everyone's doing well. My glasses are extremely crooked because they're broken. All right, anyways. All right, so the Civil Rights Movement actually happened in the 1950s and 60s, but the very roots of it, which date back to after the US Civil War, which is after 1865, that's when we started to see the movement kind of begin slowly. And it's because, the Civil War was based off of, most of it was based off of, slavery and states' rights over slavery. So when the South didn't get what they wanted and they lost the Civil War, that's when they became very bitter towards African Americans and just had an issue accepting that African Americans were now considered equal and were citizens, US citizens. So they began the process of hatred towards them through segregation and discrimination. So after 1865, which is when the Civil War ended, that is when we start to see those issues, and then we start to notice that there's this movement to try to fix it all, fix the issues caused, because of, the post-Civil War. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. All right, so let's first talk about a few amendments, constitutional amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed right after the Civil War ended, right after 1865, and they were meant to increase the rights for African Americans. So let's start with the 13th Amendment. That one was passed in 1865, the year the Civil War was over, and it officially abolished slavery. In other words, it made slavery illegal in the United States. So that was step one to trying to, make African Americans equal with the rest of the country. And then the same year, the 14th Amendment was passed, which granted citizenship to anyone born in the United States, but this was mainly for African Americans, since many people, like I said, in the South, had a hard time accepting that African Americans were considered equal to them. The government had to pass a law basically saying that they are citizens because they were born in the United States. So they are US citizens. Therefore, they are entitled to the Constitution, all the rights that everyone else is entitled to. So this says if you're born here, you are considered a citizen. But like I said, it's mainly for African Americans. And then we have the 15th Amendment. This one was passed about 5 years later after the other two. And this gave African Americans the right to vote. So it says allowed citizens the right to vote regardless of race, not gender. So this is not the amendment that gave women the right to vote, but it basically gave all men, regardless of race, the right to vote. So this is a big step here. Women don't get the right to vote till 1919, 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So, but this is, like I said, for all males. So if we look back at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, there's a way of learning it. 13, 14, 15, free citizens vote. So hopefully you can remember that for your upcoming exam. All right, so this says, although slavery was abolished with 13th Amendment and freedmen were granted citizenship and the right to vote, Southern states made it very difficult for them to practice their 14th and 15th Amendment rights. All right, so we're going to get into a new topic, segregation. So segregation means the separation of races. Many of you guys might be familiar with, you know, the way things were before African Americans and all other minorities received their civil rights. There was segregation in many states, mainly in the South, where they would separate the races in all types of categories. Education, there were Black schools and white schools only. You know, restrooms, public restrooms, all Black, all white. Water fountains, all Black, all white. Restaurants wouldn't allow Blacks in. You know, trains and buses were also segregated. Maybe certain trains allowed or buses allowed whites to sit in the front, Blacks would be in the back. That's segregation right there. So that spread all throughout the South, like mainly like those, you know, states that were part of the Civil War, part of the South during the Civil War or the Confederation, the Confederacy. So those are the states that started to adopt segregation. Like I said, they could not cope with the fact that African Americans were now considered equal to them. So segregation wasn't illegal, but it ends up becoming challenged. So there were official laws in these states. So here, the yellow states stand for segregation by law, where there were actual laws. They were called Jim Crow laws, these segregation laws that stated that, you know, Blacks are not allowed to sit in the front of a bus, or Blacks are not allowed to interracially marry or marry with other, you know, races. Those were real laws that Southern states adopted. Now in the North, the green, segregation is prohibited. That's why a lot of African Americans migrated to the North right after the Civil War, because they knew that they wouldn't experience as much racism in the North compared to the South. And then in the West, since the West was a developing area, there wasn't like a specific, there weren't laws in place, but it just wasn't specified. Maybe some places had segregation. Maybe it was up to the owner for their restaurants or other things like that, but it's not really specified. And then the purple means local. Basically, it was up to like the cities if they wanted to adopt segregation. It wasn't a state law saying, there wasn't a state law saying they couldn't or they could. It's up to the city. Okay, so let's move on. So here are just some signs, actual signs during this time period. That's how you knew there was segregation. All right, question one. What 3 constitutional amendments were passed right after the US Civil War that increased African American rights? Remember I told you free citizens vote, right? 13th, 14th, 15th. Meant to free slaves, meant to 14th, granted them citizenship so people can treat them equal. 15th, gave them the right to vote. Which amendment gave African Americans the right to vote? All right, so 13, 14, 15, the 15th Amendment. Which amendment granted African American citizenship? Free citizens vote, 13, 14, 15, right? So the 14th Amendment. Okay. Question. Did I skip a question? No. Question 4. What does segregation mean? All right, so kind of put it in your own words. What does segregation mean? I know that the words that are in the text are pretty plain and simple. That's fine. Just don't copy the whole paragraph. So segregation means separation of the races, right? To separate races like all Black and all white. places. Number 5, what part of the US had Jim Crow laws? All right, so I told you the South, right? These were the states that used to be part of the Confederacy during the Civil War. That's where slavery was present before, it was abolished before the 13th Amendment. So that's where the segregation, the discrimination began. So the South. Okay, Homer Plessy. So we're going to learn about the Plessy versus Ferguson court case, which is a very, very important court case. So Plessy is this man right here who was, I believe it was like 1/8 African American. He was a tad bit African American, mainly white. He was from Louisiana, and he decided to challenge the 14th Amendment, which is the right to citizenship, meaning he should be treated equal like everyone else. In Louisiana, in case here's Louisiana, in the South, deep South. In Louisiana, they had segregation, and he tried to board a train and sit in a section that was for whites only. And people, in this part of Louisiana, everyone knows everybody. Everybody knows their parents, their grandparents, their ancestors. So when people saw him boarding the white section of the train, they were, hysterical about it. And they called the cops and they arrested him. And they told him that he should have been sitting in the black section. And he said that, well, he was only like 1/8 black. I think it was 1/8. And, but he was mainly white. But just the fact that he was a little bit black, they consider him fully black, and he should be in the colored section, in the black section. So he, of course, sued, and he appealed the court case, the local court case, and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest court of the country. It's the judicial branch, right? So they hear major court cases, and of course, he had a good argument. He is considered an American citizen. Why is he being treated like this? Other whites are not being treated with discrimination like blacks are. And he basically just said that it should be illegal. Segregation should be illegal. And after this long court case, basically those 9 judges ruled that segregation is legal in the United States, that it is allowed. It's fine if segregation is happening in different parts, like in different facilities. But they came up with this clause, the court, that segregation is legal as long as it's equal. So as long as the black section, the white section are equal in every case, as long as white schools and black schools are equal, as long as, they're being treated equally, then segregation is legal. So all this did was make segregation worse after this court case, because then, there was segregation in certain states, in certain areas, in certain facilities, but then after this court case, everything was segregated. Segregation spread even more, and it just made things worse. And it actually took 58 years for segregation to be challenged in the Supreme Court. And we'll learn about that later on. That's the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. That court case was in 1954, 58 years after 1896. So that's when it was challenged, where they started to put that to the test. Is separation actually equal? Segregation equal? So anyways, that's what happened. That was the Plessy versus Ferguson court case. So it established the clause separate but equal. And like I said, it wasn't repealed until 58. 58 years later. All right, so here is a white school. As you can see, there is sports, there's equipment, there's desks. This is probably like a lunchroom or something. You know, there's materials and everything. This is good education, right? But this is how African-American schools looked. They were small little houses, small little shacks, no books, no desks, no seats, no food. So obviously segregation was not equal. All right. Give me 1 second. Question 6, what was the Supreme Court case that legalized segregation in the United States? That's Plessy versus Ferguson. All right, we're halfway done. Question 7, what was the clause that was established with that court case? All right. It claimed that segregation is allowed as long as everyone is treated the same. The clause is called separate but equal. Question 8, how long did segregation last in the United States before it was challenged and made illegal? 58 years, from 1896. Oh, my goodness. Barriers to voting. All right, so let's talk about the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment, remember 13, 14, 15, free citizens vote. The 15th Amendment is the one that gave African-American men the right to vote. So there were a lot of issues with African-Americans being able to practice their 15th Amendment right. They were prevented in many different ways. Here are the ways. Lynching. Lynching is when they hang you, which is death by hanging. And, you know, it was legal in many states. And then in some states it was illegal, but it was secretly happening and there were no punishments for it. It was a scare tactic. Sometimes they would, if they found out in just those racist cities in the South, if they found out that an African-American had went to vote, sometimes the next day they would end up dead because they were lynched, and they would lynch them sometimes right there by the voting office. And so whenever African Americans were planning to go vote and they walk up to the facility, they see that there's an African American lynch, right away it freaks them out, right? And they're like, never mind, I'm not going to do this. I don't want to die. I have a family, right? So that was one tactic that they used. Literacy tests. Literacy, it's a test that tests if you're literate, if you can read or write, or read and write. And they would give these literacy tests to, well, they would give them to the entire city, whichever cities adopted this. And it was a hard test that not even many whites could actually pass the test. I guess you have to be really educated. I mean, they weren't super hard, but they were confusing. And it was confusing for whites. So a lot of cities did away with the literacy test because it defeated the purpose of allowing just whites to vote. And it was because a lot of African Americans didn't have an education. That's why they would make them take this test. So it's really small, but let's look at number 1. It says, draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. So draw a line. In other words, draw a circle around the number or letter, and this is a number. So, you know what I mean? It wasn't even like a good literacy test. Poll taxes. This is where they charge a tax to vote, which this was later on deemed illegal. Like later on, it was an actual amendment. I think it was possibly the 24th Amendment. I hope I'm right about that. That made poll taxes illegal. But this was, of course, it was around for a long time. Many African Americans couldn't afford to pay a tax to vote, to practice their 15th Amendment right. You know, if they hardly had money and they had to decide, well, should I feed my family? Should I pay my rent or my bills? You know, or should I use this little bit of money to give to, you know, the government or whatever to vote, or the city government or state government? I mean, which one are you going to choose? Which one is more important? Well, feeding your family, right? So that's why places were charging poll taxes. And it was just like an annual fee where you paid it one time, but you probably need that money. It probably wasn't a lot, but it was a lot for probably African Americans that hardly had money. But this also backfired because a lot of poor whites also couldn't afford the poll tax. And then you had to bring this as proof wherever you voted, showing that you paid your poll tax. Grandfather clause, this, it won't be on the STAR exam, but basically it just states that, you know, if your grandfather was able to vote before January 1st of 1863, which is when Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. So if your grandfather was able to vote before that, then you can vote, which is really dumb because most African Americans were not able to vote at that time because, first of all, the 15th Amendment wasn't passed till 1870. And, you know, a lot of places just, you know, it wasn't allowed. There was still slavery, right? So that was a very tricky clause, but that's what a lot of places came up with because the poll tax wasn't working and the literacy test wasn't working. Okay, we're almost done. So there were a few African Americans that during this time, late 1800s, started to fight for African American rights. And there's two people that were similar, but also very different. All right, so we have Booker T. Washington, and then we have W.E.B. Du Bois. So Booker T. Washington, who was, I mean, he was an educated African American, and he felt that many people respected him because he was educated. So he stressed the importance of African Americans having an education. And he felt that if African Americans had an education, went to school, became literate, adopted useful labor skills where they're actually talented and they're working, they have a career, then they will prove their value to society and they will achieve equality, they will achieve civil rights because of that. So he stressed patience. He told African Americans, be patient, you will acquire your civil rights, but you need to have an education first so people can respect you. So, like the way they respected him. So he actually started an institution, an educational facility for African Americans known as the Tuskegee Institute. Does that sound familiar? Because we just learned about the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. The Tuskegee Airmen they came out of Booker T. Washington's institute. So that means they went to the school, they got educated, and they were trained in Air Force, right? So, and they really shined, right? So anyways, he is the founder of Tuskegee Institute, which was an educational facility for African Americans where it's a vocational school where they can acquire skills and things like that. So he was all about patience. And then we have W.E.B. Du Bois, who felt like African Americans didn't need to be educated and that they shouldn't have to have a career to be respected, to acquire civil rights. He felt that they deserved it immediately. They deserved their civil rights immediately. They were entitled to civil rights under the 14th Amendment. They are citizens. They should be treated equally like everybody else. They should not be discriminated. You know, just because, you know, they shouldn't just, you know, they shouldn't be patient and wait for civil rights, unlike Booker T. Washington wanted, right? So he just stresses that they deserve it immediately. So in order to start fighting for the rights of African Americans, he's one of the main founders, because there's quite a few, but he's one of the main ones. He founded the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is a legal organization with attorneys, and they literally will fight for your rights in the courts, like I said, legally. And so he was willing to take on, lawsuits by African Americans who are suing for civil rights. So it's still around today. It's a pretty big organization. So that's the NAACP. So he started that in 1909, and like I said, it's still around today. So a lot of the court cases that happened during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, if they won, they probably won because attorneys came out, were from the NAACP, worked for the NAACP, and were actually, how do I say it? They were actually part of, like, they were fighting for the rights of the African Americans that were carrying out the lawsuits. So they were defending them, in other words. So the NAACP, National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, like I said, it was founded by W.B. Du Bois and other founders, and it's an organization that fights for the equal rights of minorities. Now, not just African Americans, all minorities. Think of minorities: Asians, women, Hispanics. The AA doesn't stand for African Americans. It just means like colored people, all types of people. I said women. Women also, because they're considered minorities, but it started out just for colored people. But it's not just for African Americans though. All right, Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells was a muckraker. Remember when we learned about muckrakers during the Progressive Era, late 1800s, early 1900s? These were people who wanted to make progress in the country. They exposed all the problems with society. That way the government can do something about it, right? And they did this through writing. They wrote articles, newspaper articles, magazines, books, different things that tackled on problems. So Ida B. Wells was a muckraker for the early African American civil rights movement. So she was trying to make progress for African Americans by muckraking about what they're fighting for, what they're going through: discrimination, segregation. Her thing was, she was really big on trying to get rid of lynching, make lynching illegal all across the United States. In many states, it was illegal, but in the South, it wasn't. And she's like, how is that even right? How is that fair that African Americans are allowed to be executed by hanging, but not whites? Whites are not being lynched, only African Americans. That's a cruel and unusual punishment for African Americans, right? Like 8th Amendment. So, sorry. Anyways, yeah, she went on a crusade where she just tried to get rid of lynching in every single state. She wrote books, magazines. She actually went on a campaign where she just went giving speeches, trying to talk to leaders of the states and just tried to get rid of it. And she made a lot of progress, but she did a lot of research and exposed lynching. And many people weren't aware that lynching was so bad or so big in the South. All right, here are the founders of the NAACP. Ida B. Wells is one of them. And then we have W.B. Du Bois right here. And there's a lot of whites as well. It wasn't, like I said, this isn't only for African Americans. So I love the diversity here. Question 9, what were 2 ways that African Americans were prevented from practicing the 15th Amendment? 15th Amendment means the right to vote. What were 2 ways that they were prevented from voting? We talked about lynching as a scare tactic, the literacy tests, the poll tax, having to pay, right, to vote, and then the grandfather clause. So just write 2 down. Question 10, which African American leader demanded immediate civil rights and established the NAACP? So the one that said that they're entitled to immediate civil rights under the 14th Amendment, and he founded an organization to start to fight for their rights. That is W.E.B. Du Bois. Question 11, what is the purpose of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People? The purpose of this is to legally fight for African American rights, legally, in court. So it's legal help for that. Question 12, we're almost done. Was segregation ever equal? Separating the races, was that ever equal? Explain why or why not. So I showed you images, we talked about it. Clearly segregation was never equal. You saw the schools, Black schools and white schools were completely different. White schools had resources, they had desks, they had sports, while African American schools did not have resources, textbooks, desks. It wasn't an actual, a lot of these weren't an actual facility, right? It was like a little house, like a little shack or something, right? And then, just there's many ways to kind of compare this, segregation. But you can give your own example. If you know some, if maybe you learned about the civil rights movement before this class, then feel free to share what you know. All right. And that is it for today. Have a great day. I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.